All right, we're ready to start 2 Thessalonians this morning in our survey. We just finished 1 Thessalonians last week, and we are ready for 2 Thessalonians. We're going to cover chapters 1 and 2 as well as an introduction, so we've got our work cut out for us because chapter 2 is one of the more difficult chapters of not only 1st or 2nd Thessalonians, but of the New Testament. So we're going to try to do the impossible. Let's see if we can. Let's do some introductory things to the book. We won't go greatly in detail, but we'll get the general idea of what's going on. The author of this book is Paul, like the first letter. We know that from chapter 1 and verse 1. We know that from chapter 3 and 17. Identifies himself in his own hand later at the end of the book. Where the letter was written is probably Corinth. We conclude that because without rehearsing all the information that we talked about in the first letter, you remember how that he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica, and that Timothy came to him at Corinth, and that seems to be where he was, and Timothy and Silas are with him as he writes the first letter. They're still with him, according to chapter 1 and verse 1, so our conclusion is most likely he's still at Corinth. Now, can we be 100% sure? No, the text doesn't tell us that information. If that be correct, and it seems to be written soon after the first letter, and perhaps as a reaction to their reaction to the first letter, then the date would be about 52 to 53 AD. Again, Silas and Timothy are with him. Paul is going to deal with some error that may have been an outgrowth of a misunderstanding of the first letter. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So what was the circumstance that prompted the letter? There seemed to be a misunderstanding about the second coming. And misunderstanding was that it was imminent, that it's about to happen. Now, in the first letter, he addresses a misunderstanding of that if Christ comes, are those who are dead at a disadvantage to those who are alive. And so he corrects that. And so there seems to have been a misunderstanding about the second coming where some are thinking that it's about to immediately happen. So much so that they had quit work thinking that if it's going to happen, there's no need for us to continue to work. And you would have the same conclusion. If you were assured that Christ was going to come back within the next 30 days, and you had enough to live on for 30 days, why go to work? And why do anything else? Why except try to get ready for the second coming? But they had become busybodies, as we'll see in chapter 3. Now, where did they get that idea? Chapter 2, let me back up to say, deals with the fact that they had this misunderstanding. Chapter 3 shows the problem that was created, and that is it was creating laziness and gossip because they quit work and they're gossiping and meddling in other people's affairs. Now, where did they get that idea? Two possible sources. One was in chapter 5, in verse 5 of 1 Thessalonians, that he talked about how the second coming of the Lord would come as a thief in the night, and it would bring sudden destruction. Some have speculated that maybe that was misinterpreted by some, thinking that Paul meant it's going to be immediate. It's about to suddenly happen right now. That may be. Another and a greater possibility is that some had taught this doctrine and had forged Paul's name. A forged letter was not uncommon. Now notice in chapter 2, and we'll get to this a little bit later, at verse 2, that they were not to be shaken either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day had come. In other words, about to come. So those are the two possible sources for that misunderstanding, but that's being addressed here in 2 Thessalonians. Let's talk about the nature of the book, and then we're ready to move into the flow of the book itself. This is a little different tone than the first letter. Here are a couple of quotes that help us with that. J. Sidlow Baxter said, "The gentler and more guarded reproof of the first letter therefore gives place to sterner words." 2 Thessalonians is a little sterner than 1 Thessalonians. And I think Everett F. Harrison said it best when he said, in the first epistle we see the nurse's tenderness, in the second we see the father's discipline. And so there was that tenderness of the first letter, and it's a little sterner in the second letter because he's addressing a specific era that needs to be hammered down because of the results that come because some had bought into that era. Here is our outline of the book, and three things are happening, 3 chapters. I call the book simply The Time of the Lord's Coming. That seems to be the focal point, where The second coming was the theme of the first letter, the time of the second, more specific than the first letter. And so here we deal with during persecutions in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the heart and the core of the book, and that is the second coming will not come until there is an apostasy. And then he deals in chapter 3 dealing with the disorderly. What do you do with those who have become disorderly because of this error? How do you deal with them? That's 2 Thessalonians 3. All right, any questions or comments on introductory information and what the overview of the book is? All right, let's go to our questions, if I can find mine here. And let's get some questions out of the way. You ought to be able to get the first question. What's the theme of 2 Thessalonians? Yeah, the time. It deals with the second coming. Every chapter, as did 1 Thessalonians, deals with the second coming. But the focal point has to do with the time of it. Is it going to be immediate? Question number 2, we've already answered. When was the book written? About 52, 53 AD. Let's drop down to question number 6. This is important. If you didn't get this in my introductory information, you need to get this now. What was the misconception about the second coming? Yeah, they thought he was about to immediately to return. George? Yeah, he's coming soon. Yeah, it's about to immediately happen. Is it possible at any point, even at their time, let me erase that. Is it possible from our vantage point that the Lord's coming could be immediate? Sure, it could be. It could be immediate. Do we know it's going to be immediate? That's what we don't know. And that's the point to be learned from this, at least in application to us. There are those who in the premillennial circles that begin to speculate that it's about to happen in 1988 or 1987, I think it was. Some guy wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Lord is Returning in 1988. Well, he didn't. So not any one of the reasons were correct. But then they recalculate, and it's going to happen another year. Maybe it's going to happen in the 90s. Maybe it's going to happen in the 2000s, 2010, and on down the line, and there's still speculations going on. Let's get another question out of the way, and let's go to question number 4. What's the point of chapter 1? All right, there is a misunderstanding. All right. In the first letter, why did he write to them in the first place? Why did he leave and then he had to send Timothy back? And what was that all about? Say again. About what? Bingo. Absolutely. It had to do with this concern. Are they enduring the persecution? And so he gets a report back from Timothy. Things are going well. So the first chapter deals with the fact that they are enduring persecution. So let's look at that, chapter 1. That they are enduring persecution, and he thanks God for that. The persecution apparently is still on. The pressure to some degree is still there. And he's thankful to God they are enduring, and he gives them some advice of how looking toward the judgment, verses 5 to 10, is going to help with that. Makes sense? So this is the reaction to what he heard from Timothy. I heard that things are going well. So before I address the era, chapter 2, let me address how well things are going. So because we want to spend some time in chapter 2, we're going to kind of quickly work through this. This is a simple chapter. So let's look at verses 1 and 2. That's a simple greeting. It's not that it's unimportant, but it's a simple greeting of Paul and Silas and Timothy to the church at Thessalonica, grace, peace, etc., in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, at verse 3 beginning, he gives thanks to God for the Thessalonians' faithfulness and endurance. So he said, I'm thankful that you have strong faith and that you're enduring through this. What does he say? Verse 3. What's the first thing he mentions? All right, he gives thanks to God. Benson said he wraps up his praise of men in the praise of God. That's interesting. In other words, he's commending them, but in commending them, he praises God for what he sees in them. Does that make sense? In other words, instead of maybe just praising somebody for how great they are or how well they're doing or how strong they are, it might be helpful to tell them, I thank God and I praise God that you are what you are. You see how he's wrapping the praise of men in the praise of God? Vincent is indeed correct. First thing he mentions is he was thankful that what? Their faith grows. It's not only growing, abundantly or exceedingly. What does that mean? It's increasing, but it's more than everyone's faith may be increasing to some degree, but theirs is increasing continually and rapidly. In other words, here there's an abundance of growth. There's great growth in their faith. They're diligently growing. And furthermore, the second thing he mentions is their love abounds toward each other. Now, he was concerned about that. He mentions that in the first letter. But their love for one another in the midst of persecution, instead of turning on one another, they're loving one another. Now, verse 4, he said, you're patient in persecution and tribulation. That we ourselves boast among the churches of God for your pay. In other words, we tell other brethren where we've gone, like here at Corinth, we're telling them about you. What are they saying about them? That they were patient. What's the idea of patience? Long-suffering, enduring. The patience and your faith in all your persecution and tribulations that you endure. And the persecution and tribulation is not much different except in the connotation of the word itself. The word persecute means to drive away. The word tribulation has to do with pressure. It alludes to an ancient form of execution where pressure is put upon the body until finally the body is crushed and the person dies. And so what he's saying is that the enemy is persecuting. They're trying to drive you away from the Lord, number one, and they're putting pressure, crushing pressure on you. But you've stood up to that, and we're thankful to God for that. All right, questions or comments on that? All right, let's go to 5 to 10. His point here is that if you look toward the judgment and the second coming, which is what the books are about, the two books, first and second, if you look toward the second coming, that's going to help you endure. You already are enduring. But let me give you some advice, Paul is saying, or let me give you some instruction that'll continue to help you make this even easier. And so what does he say here? You tell me. 5 to 10, what's his point? Summarized in one sentence.
Persecution's going to happen. And they're told about it. And it's up to them how they handle it.
All right, yeah, persecution's going to happen, number one. Number two, if you look toward the second coming, two things are going to happen. Or several. All right, the wicked are going to be punished, yes. So your persecutor is going to be punished. And you're going to be granted relief and vindicated, absolutely. So that ought to encourage us. All right, let's work through that and see what we see. We'll look at verse 5, though verse 7 and verse 10 make the same point. God will vindicate those who are enduring. Which is your manifest evidence? What he's saying here is that your endurance is evidence of the righteous judgment of God. In other words, what he's saying is that God's righteous judgment, your endurance is proof that the true disciples, which remain faithful, that God indeed will be just in his judgment. When we endure, that proves that we're worthy to be counted as an heir of the kingdom, as he mentions here, that you're counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you also suffer. All right, now let's look at 6 through 10, or 6 through 9. God's going to punish the persecutor. We quote this out of context, and I don't think it's a misuse of it, talking about those who just don't obey the gospel. Same point's made, but he's putting it in the context of the persecutor. So let's see what he says. That since this is a righteous thing for God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you. In other words, your persecutor is going to get tribulation from God. That's even worse than what they do. And to give rest to you who are troubled, when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven, there's the second coming, with his mighty angels. And when he comes, he's coming in flaming fire, which suggests vengeance, taking vengeance on those that don't know God and obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And what's going to happen to him? Who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord. Now, What I'm learning from that is God's going to punish the persecuted. That's the point in the context. Now, let's lift that out of its context and make proper use of it. What do I learn as far as practical application today? We're not being persecuted. What does this text tell me? All right, don't get in his place. Don't get in his way. That's a good point. Let God take vengeance. I don't need to worry about those persecuting me. God's going to take care of them. All right. And that ought to encourage us in that when somebody does me wrong, I just need to press on. When somebody's trying to get me to drift away from the Lord's going to take care of them in the end of time, and God will vindicate me. It looks like I'm not going to be vindicated, but at the end of time, I'll be vindicated if I'm doing what's right. And that ought to encourage us. All right, let's go further. Let's go now to verse 11. His prayer was that the Thessalonians would continue to endure. So basically, all this chapter is saying, you are enduring. Here's some things that will help you to endure, and I'm praying that you will continue to endure. So I call the chapter Enduring Persecution, because that's what it's about. Let's get verse 11. Two things happen here. He wants them to be counted worthy, that we also pray always for you. Now notice he had prayed in the first Thessalonian letter that they would endure. And by the way, at the beginning of this chapter, it seems to be my prayer was answered. What I prayed for has happened, that you have endured. And so, again, he prays that you may count, that God would count you worthy of this calling and fulfill all the good pleasure of his goodness and the work of faith and power. In other words, I pray that you may be counted worthy. But that's not all. Look at verse 12. What does he say at verse 12? When you endure, that will glorify God. Because that's the aim of those who are the children of God. So does that make sense, what we've seen in this chapter? Let's back up here. Enduring persecution. We're about ready to leave this chapter because I want to spend the rest of our time in chapter 2. It's the most difficult. But here he's talking about, after the greetings, I thank God for you. In other words, I prayed for you, I sent Timothy to you, and I got a good report back, and I'm glad to learn this. Learn what? Well, your faith is growing exceedingly, your love abounds, and you're enduring through persecution and pressure. Now, what I want to tell you is, if you look toward the judgment, that's going to help, because your persecutors will be punished, and you will be vindicated. That ought to help you endure. And here's what I pray. I pray that you will continue to endure and that you may be counted worthy. In other words, that you may be exalted and ultimately God is glorified. That's what I'm praying. Make sense? Enduring persecution. That's chapter 1. What's chapter 2 about? I don't know if I had a question on that, but I should have, and so I'll ask it now. What is it about? The great apostasy. Yes. The great apostasy. Let's go to question number 7. What did Paul say must happen first before the Lord returned? There's going to be a falling away. All right? Let's get question number... Number 8. This may open a bag of worms, but we'll shove them back in if they get out. What are the characteristics of the man of sin? Not who is he or what is he. That won't open a can of worms, I don't guess. What is his characteristic? He objects to God. Exalts himself. Considers himself God. Disregards the law, yes.
Lives contrary to the will of God.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good point. Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, question number 9. We're going to hang on question 9. I'm not ready to open that one up yet. We'll get to that. All right, let's look at chapter 2 now. And let's see if we can make some sense of chapter 2. I call it the Great Apostasy and the encouragement to stand fast, because those are two separate points. There's the great apostasy, 1 to 12. There's encouragement to stand fast. Let's get ahead of it. Let's skip 1 to 12 just mentally, just for a moment. And he goes right back to this point of standing fast and standing firm. Don't let the persecutors get to you. Don't let the pressure get to you. Stand fast, stand firm. But he talks about this great apostasy, and that's because of this misunderstanding. And so let's not lose sight of the misunderstanding. That the misunderstanding was some were teaching, whether from a misapplication of Paul or whether it was from a forged letter, they're teaching and had infiltrated the church at Thessalonica with a doctrine that said Jesus was about to immediately return. It's not a ways off. We know it's not a ways off. It's coming real soon. So much so, some were convinced of that, and chapter 3 shows they had quit work and had become lazy. So because of that, he needs to address that. So let's talk about this great apostasy. His point here is that is not about to happen. We get sidetracked. Let me footnote here. We get sidetracked worrying about who the man of sin is and what is the restraining force. Those are two major questions, and we're going to touch on those and try to make sense of that. But we get so focused on that, we forget the major thrust of the text. And I don't want us to lose sight of the thrust of the text. His point is, here is a false doctrine that says he's about to immediately return. And he said that's not going to happen until there is first this great apostasy. The man of sin is revealed, and there is a restraining force holding him back, and yet he's going to be let go. And then when that happens, he said, after that, at some point after that, he didn't say immediately after that, but after that would be when the second coming would take place. So it's not about to take place immediately. Not about to take place immediately. That's his point. And that's all that we really, if we walk away with that, still scratching our head saying, I don't know who the man of sin is, I don't know what the restraining force is. And you probably will walk away saying, I don't know what either one of those are. You still got the thrust of the chapter. There was a misunderstanding about the second coming. It's not going to happen until there's an apostasy. Make sense? All right, let's see if we can make some sense of chapter 2. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. His point is, don't be troubled in thinking the second coming is about to immediately take place. Let's get verses 1 and 2. Now concerning our Lord Jesus Christ and the gathering together to him, that is the second coming and our gathering, which had been mentioned in chapter 4 of the first letter. We ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Now let's talk about those two verses for a moment. Barclay said this, and I think he said it best. He said, this is undoubtedly one of the most difficult passages in the whole New Testament. And it is so because it is using terms and thinking in pictures which are perfectly familiar to those to whom Paul was speaking, but which are utterly strange to us. I think he's right about that, because he mentions the fact that he had talked to them about this previously. So this letter is a reminder of some teaching he's already given them. Make sense? It's like you walk into a congregation as a visitor, and you're in the second part of a series of sermons where the foundation has already been given in lesson 1, and you say, I don't understand the terminology that he's using. He's addressing a problem here in this local church, and he's using terminology that I'm not familiar with because I wasn't a part of that first segment. But they understand. Make sense? That's kind of parallel. It's not exactly parallel, but it gets the idea. Now let's go back to verse 1. The difficulty here, that when we get to this chapter, has to do with two things I've already mentioned. Who is the man of sin, and what is the restraining force? Now at verse 2, he asks them not to be soon shaken, or troubled, or disturbed. How could this teaching, the second coming of Christ is going to be immediate, disturb someone? Well, in 1843, Barnes made this observation that in 1843, 17 people were admitted to a lunatic asylum in Worcester, Massachusetts, and became deranged in consequence of an expectation that the Lord was about to appear. Is that common? I don't know. But I think if we could get on the television and convince the nation that he's about to appear for those who believe in the Christ, I think you'd see some mighty strange things going on if they were convinced he's about to come within this week. And so they were disturbed. They're bothered by spirit. Perhaps that has reference to those who claim to have the Spirit of God, or by word, that is instruction, or by letter. And that letter may have reference to the first letter and the misunderstanding that we've talked about, or a forged letter, as if from us, gives us the hint that maybe there was perhaps a forged letter. Barnes says that was not uncommon. Now, at the end of verse 2 is a key phrase, and that is, as the day of the Lord had come. That is, it has arrived. That is, it's now here. Not in past tense, but it's now here. It's about to take place. The time has come for the Lord to return. That's the idea. Now, let me stop for a moment because I forgot to do this. I've tried to give key verses to each chapter. A key verse for chapter 1 would be verse 5. Key verse for chapter 2 would be verse 3. And lest I forget, next week, if you want to jump over there, chapter 3 would be verse 6. So 5, 3, and 6. 5, 3, and 6 are key verses. All right. So, now beginning at verse 3, his point is, there must first be an apostasy. It's not going to happen until there's an apostasy. If you get that point, you've got the thrust of chapter 2. And you say, I still don't understand the man of sin. Okay, you've got the thrust of chapter 2. So let's get verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for the day of the Lord will not come unless a falling away comes first. There's going to be a major apostasy. Have there already been some individuals to depart? Sure. In fact, chapter 3 shows some had already done that within that local church. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a major apostasy. Now, as a footnote, you remember in Acts 20? In Acts 20, Paul told the elders of the church at Ephesus that after his departure, savage wolves would come in. What did he say? Not sparing the flock, but draw away disciples after them. Remember that? That was a prophecy of a major apostasy. So is this chapter. Other chapters would relate to the same concept, but we won't take the time to develop all of those. Now, I want to go back and emphasize, and then we're going to deal with this man of sin, and as quickly as we can. But I want you to get, and you might underline at verse 3, get the thrust, lest we focus too much on the man of sin, that the day of the Lord is not going to come unless a falling away comes first. That's his point. The man of sin, the restraining force, all has to do with his apostasy. But there's going to be an apostasy first. Has apostasy occurred? Yes. There have been major apostasies. So is this passage telling us he's not going to come until first there's a falling away that we've got to wait till that takes place? No, it's not telling me that. What has dealt with in this context has already taken place. Now let's talk about this man of sin being revealed, who or whatever that may be. Let's focus on him just for a moment. Let's get the text, and we're going to come back and make some application. Let me jump ahead to the conclusion, and then I'm going to tell you how I got there. I'm convinced the man of sin doesn't refer to one single person. I'm convinced the man of sin doesn't deal with one single apostasy. I think it's much like the phrase the Antichrist. Some think the Antichrist deals with one particular person. Who is that? That must be the Pope. But I think it's anyone and anything that is opposed to Christ. Well, the same thing is here, that this is a personification of an attitude that leads to apostasy. So let's get the characteristics, what's going to be revealed, his deception, and then we'll come back and make some application of that. First of all, verse 4. We don't have time to deal with every detail. He opposes God, and he exalts himself above all that is called God, so that he's worshiped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God. Some think that temple refers not to the temple in Jerusalem, but perhaps the church, showing himself that he's God. In other words, as you read this, you're going to say, well, this sounds a whole lot like the description of what later was developed into the papacy, the Pope. Good point. Let's talk about that in a moment. All right? His characteristic is he opposes God, opposes things that are of God, and he exalts himself as if he is God. All right? What else? He's going to be revealed. But there is some force that is restraining him. Now, verse 5 tells me, while we may not understand, do you not remember that when I was with you, I told you these things? He's explained some things to them before that we don't have that explanation. Now, at verse 6, and now you know that what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. There is some force that's restraining him from moving full-fledged forward. Now, let's see what else is. So he's going to be revealed. Now, verse 7 mentions he is already at work. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Whatever the man of sin is, whatever concept it is, whatever person it is, whatever organization that may be, it's involved in the work of lawlessness, and it's already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. And so the restraining force is going to be taken out of the way. That tells me the restraining force is probably not God. Probably is not the gospel. Because the restraining force is going to be taken out of the way. Key to interpreting that. Now 9 through 12, he's going to be deceptive and lead some astray. He's going to be involved in the work of Satan. So he's going to be involved in deception. Look at verse 10. With all unrighteous deception among those who perish. Some will reject the truth for a lie because of his work. Verse 11. With all unrighteous deception among those who perish because it received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. The consequence, verse 12, is they will be damned. Condemned. All right. Let's go back to the thrust. Nothing about the second coming is going to take place until there's an apostasy. In this apostasy, the man of sin is going to be revealed, but he's being restrained. So what or who is that? Well, let's go. Here's some keys that may help me understand who this is. You read 100 commentaries and you'll probably get 100 different variations. They may even say the same thing, that it refers to the Pope, but then they have a different variation how they got there. But whatever this is, it comes from within. It's a departure. So it doesn't seem to be an outside force coming in. It's something that came from within and moves outward. Make sense? This is an apostasy. This is a departure. So if a force of an atheist came in and began to infiltrate the church here and try to teach us, we don't call that an apostasy unless he leads people astray. But when someone rises up from among us and leads people astray, that's an apostasy. Make sense? This is coming from within. Secondly, the man of sin is going to be revealed in the midst of apostasy, whatever that man of sin is. The history of departures are going to help us. For example, the first major apostasy was the rise that resulted, took years to develop, the rise of Catholicism, but started with the power of bishops, and then they developed the cardinals, and later they had the chief cardinal, which then they later called a pope in 606 AD. So does this refer to the Pope? I think he's included, but I don't think it specifically refers to the papacy. Whatever we put to this, it has to meet these descriptions because he exalts himself, opposes, was restrained for a while, was deceptive, he works lawlessness. So what's it talking about? I think it's a personification of the spirit of apostasy. I think it's the personification, in other words, the spirit of lawlessness is at work, is pictured as if it's a one person. That's why I say it's personification. I think the Pope would be one application of that, though there are many other applications. It's the personification of the spirit or the attitude of departure. This apostasy is going to take place. That spirit is going to be revealed. Now, let me give you a quotation from Lipscomb that helps me. Said Roman Catholicism, though, and many commentators say this points right to the development of Catholicism. All right, when we get through, I'll say, okay, I agree, but not exclusively. But anyway, Lipscomb said, Roman Catholicism, I have no doubt, is one development or outgrowth of this man of sin. But the same principle manifests itself in many different forms in the history of the church. I agree with that. Whenever or wherever men in the church have added to, taken from, or changed God's laws or institutions, the man of sin is at work. I would agree with that. What he's saying is, when the next apostasy come along, it's that same man of sin that's at work. So what is the restraining force? We're running out of time, so let's talk about the restraining force. Some think it's God. Well, verse 7 is telling me the restraining force is going to be taken out of the way. I don't think it refers to God. Some think it's the gospel, that's what's holding him back. Well, the gospel never was taken out of the way. I think it's probably the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire is what kept Catholicism from developing sooner and quicker, because paganism was the part of the Roman Empire. That was the religion of the Roman Empire. And finally, the Roman Empire is taken out of the way. Whatever it was is taken out of the way. Some think it's just lawlessness within itself. Well, lawlessness was still around, but the Roman Empire isn't. There's something was taken out of the way that was a restraining force. And that makes sense for a full development of that thought. And when I say full, you're going to spend some time reading. I would suggest Walton Weaver's commentary on the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It's excellent. And I know that's a hurried look at that concept. Does that make sense? So I don't expect you to walk away saying, I have a clear, crystal clear understanding of who the man of sin is. If you do, then help me, because I don't have that clear crystal. I have an idea that it's a personification of an attitude. I don't expect you to walk away saying, I've got a crystal clear idea of the restraining force. If you do, help me, because mine's still a little fuzzy, but it seems to make sense that it is the Roman Empire, something that was taken out of the way that was a restraining force. Whatever it is, I'm not too worried about that. However, identifying the man of sin or the restraining force, I know this much. The second coming was not going to take place until there was a major apostasy. And that's what he's trying to tell them. Make sense?
So could we just say then that the apostasy has already came for us? And for us, the things Paul talked about here is things that they've understood more than we do. And there's really all the lawlessness. I know in 1 John it talked about John says we are practicing sin as lawlessness. But what I need to glean from is there's going to be a second coming. It's not until after this apostasy. But and God's going to send the delusions for they'll believe the lie. They'll believe all this, and it's their own fault because they reject God. Therefore, they're going to be punished.
Yes. And I think you're right. In application to us, what am I going to take from this text? I'm not looking for the man of sin. I'm interested in what it is. I'd like to know more details. I'd like to know more about the restraining force. But there's some hints in the context that give me enough information that I think I can put, and as one friend of mine says, it's not. This may be a guess, but it's an educated guess based upon history and based upon the text. Some hints at the text. But when we get through, whether I understand who the man of sin is or the restraining force, either one, what I take away is the second coming is not going to take place until the major apostasy is developed. It has developed again and again and again. So for us, the second coming could happen at any moment. It's not a guarantee it's about to happen at any moment, but it could. Make sense? Yes, ma'am. I think absolutely right. One last thought and we're done, and that is This is pretty simple, so I'm not going to even spend any time with it, but verses 13 to 17 comes back to this point. Therefore, since you now are clarified about this second coming, you need to stand fast. Stand fast and hold to what you've been taught, and may God establish you and strengthen you, and don't let the pressure get to you. That's what he's saying. Chapter 3 next time.